I don't usually talk about this, not because I signed something, not because someone told me to stay quiet. I talk about it because every time I try to explain what happened out there, I watch people's faces change. First, they look interested, then confused. Then they get that look, the one that says they're trying to figure out if I'm joking or if I need help. So I stopped telling the story at dinner tables and bars. But I've been carrying it for 6 years now, and it's getting heavy. There were 6 of us on the dive team at the Haakon Ridge platform. North Sea, about 340 kilometers off the Norwegian coast. If you don't know what that means, imagine the most isolated place you've ever been. Now remove the land. Now make the water 180 meters deep beneath you. Now add winter. I'm going to tell you what we saw. All 6 of us, together, in the same place, at the same time, with working equipment and no substances in our systems. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, in the order it happened, and then I'm going to tell you what happened to the 6 of us afterward. Because that part matters just as much as the thing itself. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I spent 11 years as a saturation diver. If you don't know what that is, it's a job where you live in a pressurized chamber on the platform for weeks at a time, your body slowly adjusting to the pressure of the deep. So you can work on the seafloor and on subsea structures without having to decompress after every dive. You breathe a mix of helium and oxygen. Your voice goes high and strange. You sleep, eat, work, and exist in a steel tube the size of a large closet, shared with 1 or 2 other divers. You go out. You work, you come back, you do it again. It does things to you, that life. Not bad things, necessarily, but things. You stop being afraid of the dark the way normal people are afraid of the dark. You stop being afraid of small spaces. You stop being afraid of pressure and cold, and the sounds metal makes when the ocean pushes against it at depth. You become, in a very specific way, comfortable in a place that was never designed for human beings. That comfort is useful. It is also, I think now, a kind of blindness. The 6 of us had all been doing this for years. Jensen was the most experienced, 18 years, had worked platforms from the Gulf of Mexico to Southeast Asia. Quiet man, methodical, the kind of diver who checked his equipment 3 times before every entry and never once complained about anything. Priya had come up through the Norwegian system, one of the best technical divers I've ever worked alongside. The kind of person who sees a problem underwater and solves it before you finished identifying it. Torres and Mac were a unit. They'd worked together for so long they barely needed to talk during dives. Just a system of taps and gestures they developed over years on the same teams. Lindqvist was the youngest of us, maybe 32 at the time, but sharp. The kind of sharp that comes from paying close attention to everything, always. And then there was me. We'd been deployed to Haakon Ridge for a scheduled maintenance rotation, inspection of the subsea wellhead infrastructure, some repair work on a section of pipeline that had shown anomalous pressure readings in the monitoring system. Standard work, the kind of job we'd all done versions of dozens of times. Nobody was nervous. Nobody had a bad feeling. We flew out by helicopter on a Tuesday morning in late October. And the platform was already cold and gray, and the sea was the color of old iron. And none of us thought anything of it, because that's just what the North Sea looks like in October. The platform crew was a full rotation. Around 60 people total. Engineers, roustabouts, catering staff, medics. Normal offshore community. We knew a few faces from previous rotations. The installation manager, a Scotsman named Callum, who'd been running platforms for 20 years, met us at the helipad and walked us through the operational briefing. Nothing unusual. Pressure readings had stabilized since the initial anomaly. The repair work will probably be a 2-week job, maybe 3 if the weather turned. The weather turned on day 4. That's not the story. The storm was bad, but not exceptional for that time of year. We went into a weather stand-down, which means no diving operations, which means you live in the saturation system and wait. You read, you play cards, you sleep more than you should. You talk sometimes. Though after years in SAT, you learn that conversation has a natural limit. 6 people in close quarters for weeks at a time develop a kind of comfortable silence that outsiders would probably find strange. Jensen spent most of the stand-down reading. Priya ran equipment checks obsessively, which was her way of managing the stillness. Torres and Mac played cards. Lindqvist wrote letters, actual handwritten letters, which I always found both old-fashioned and somehow reassuring. I slept mostly, and when I wasn't sleeping, I was watching the pressure gauges the way you do when you've been doing this long enough that the numbers start to feel like a language. The numbers were fine. On day 6 of the stand-down, the storm broke enough for limited operations. We didn't dive that day. The swell was still too significant for safe bell handling. But we ran system checks and prepared for the following morning. Everything was nominal. Everyone was ready. That night, Lindqvist said something at dinner that I've thought about many times since. He said, "Does it feel different to you out here?" I asked what he meant. He thought about it for a moment and then said, "Quieter. Not quieter like the storm stopped. Quieter like something stopped." Nobody said anything for a few seconds. Then Torres said he was probably just tired from the stand-down. Then we talked about something else. But I noticed that Jensen didn't say anything at all, just kept eating. And Priya, who was sitting across from me, met my eyes for just a moment, and then looked back down at her food. I didn't sleep well that night. I told myself it was the change in routine. I told myself it was the tail end of the storm, the way pressure systems affect mood and sleep. I told myself a lot of things, lying in my bunk in the saturation chamber, listening to the sounds of the platform, the constant mechanical hum, the distant creak of steel, the processed air moving through the ventilation. And underneath all of it, very faint, something else. I couldn't identify it then. I'm not sure I can identify it now. The closest I can get is this. You know how sometimes, in a room full of people, the conversation stops all at once? That sudden collective silence that happens for no reason? It felt like that. Except it wasn't sound that had stopped. It was something else. Something I didn't have a word for. I checked the pressure gauges one more time before I closed my eyes. Still nominal, still fine. I should have paid more attention to what I was feeling instead of what the instruments were telling me. That's the thing about working at depth for long enough. You start to trust the equipment more than your own senses. Your own senses have been wrong before. The equipment, when it's calibrated and checked and maintained, is reliable. But there are things the equipment isn't built to measure. We found that out the next morning. If you're listening to this and you work offshore, or you've worked offshore, or you have someone in your life who does, I want you to know that what I'm about to describe is not something I've been able to explain in 6 years of trying. I've talked to people in the industry who I trust completely. I've looked for reports, for other accounts, for anything. What I found, or didn't find, is part of the reason I'm finally talking about this here. Because the silence has to end somewhere. And I figure, if it happened to 6 experienced professionals in the middle of the North Sea, it's possible it happened to someone else too. So, if you've been carrying something similar, you'll know what I mean by the time I'm done. The dive bell went down at 6:40 the next morning. Me, Jensen, and Priya on the first rotation. The sea had calmed enough. Visibility at depth was reasonable, not good. The North Sea is never good, but workable. We had our objective, we had our equipment, we had everything we needed. For the first 40 minutes, it was a completely normal dive. And then Jensen stopped moving. Jensen doesn't stop moving on dives. That's the thing you have to understand about him. 18 years underwater. The man was a machine, not in a cold way, in a reliable way, the way a good engine is a machine. Consistent, economical, every movement deliberate and necessary. I had never once seen him pause without a reason. And in the 40-plus combined dives we'd done together on various platforms over the years, I had learned to read his body language the way you learn to read weather. Jensen slowing down meant something needed attention. Jensen stopping completely meant something was wrong. He was about 4 meters ahead of me, working along the pipeline section we'd been tasked to inspect. Priya was another 3 meters to his left, running the visual survey with the camera rig. I was behind them both, managing the umbilical and monitoring the comms panel on my forearm unit. Standard formation. We'd done it 100 times. And then Jensen just stopped. He didn't signal. He didn't turn around. He didn't do anything. He just stopped moving forward and stayed there, facing whatever was ahead of him in the dark water. I waited 3 seconds. That's the protocol. If a diver stops, you give them 3 seconds before you query. Because sometimes you stop to look at something, and the last thing you want is chatter in your ear while you're assessing. 3 seconds passed. I pressed the comms. Jensen, status. Nothing for 2 seconds. Then his voice came back through the helium mix. That strange, high, slightly cartoonish quality that saturation divers' voices have at depth, which you get completely used to after a while, but which sounds deeply wrong to anyone who's never heard it. He said, "Come up here." That was it. No status report, no description of what he was looking at. Just, "Come up here." I signaled Priya. She'd already stopped and was looking toward Jensen. I moved forward along the pipeline, keeping my light directed ahead, watching the cone of illumination push back the dark and then fail, the way lights always fail down there. You get maybe 8-10 meters of useful visibility, and then the ocean just takes over and there's nothing. It's not darkness like a dark room. It's darkness like an absence, like the light never existed. I reached Jensen and came up alongside him. He was looking down. We were at the base of the wellhead structure at this point, a complex arrangement of pipes, valves, and infrastructure that sits on the seafloor and connects the reservoir below to the platform above. It's not a beautiful piece of engineering, but it's an impressive one. I'd worked on dozens of them. I knew what they looked like, what they sounded like through the water, what they felt like when you put your hand against the metal and felt the vibration of everything working the way it was supposed to. I looked at where Jensen was looking. About 2 meters below the base of the wellhead, where the structure meets the seafloor sediment, there was a gap. Not a structural gap, not something that was supposed to be there. More like a clearing in the sediment, a circular area maybe 3 meters across where the seafloor was completely clear of the silt and marine growth that covered everything else down there. Just bare rock, dark and clean and perfectly, almost geometrically, circular. And in the center of it, the sediment was moving. Not being disturbed, not churned up by a current or displaced by something passing through. Moving, rising very slowly in a column, like smoke in still air, straight up from the seafloor, dispersing about a meter above the surface, and then gone. Continuous, steady, like something below was breathing. I stared at it for what was probably 15 seconds and felt nothing at first. That's the training. You see something anomalous. You observe, you assess, you don't react until you understand what you're looking at. My brain was running through possibilities. Thermal vent activity, methane seepage, sediment disturbance from the structure's vibration. All of those things happen on the seafloor. All of them have explanations. But a thermal vent would show heat differential on the sensors. Methane seepage would show on the gas monitors. Sediment disturbance from vibration doesn't produce a column. It disperses. Priya came up on my left. I heard her breathing change through the comms, just slightly, just a fraction. The way breathing changes when you see something that doesn't fit. None of us said anything for a long moment. Then Jensen said very quietly, in that strange high voice, "How long do you think it's been doing that?" It wasn't really a question. It was the thing you say when you're trying to make something feel normal by putting words around it. I told him I didn't know. Priya said, "It's not on any of the survey maps." She was right. We had the full seabed survey data for this section of the field. Every anomalous feature had been logged and categorized. There was nothing in the data about a cleared area at the base of the wellhead. Nothing about sediment movement. Nothing about anything like what we were looking at. Which meant either the survey was wrong or this was new. I reported up to the dive supervisor on the platform. Gave him a factual description. Cleared sediment area, approximately 3 meters diameter. Continuous sediment column rising from center point. No heat differential on sensors, no gas readings. Read it out like a checklist because that's how you communicate underwater when you want people to take you seriously. No emotion, just data. There was a pause on the line. Then the dive supervisor, a man named Erickson, who I had worked with before and respected completely, said, "Can you describe the column more specifically?" I described it again. Rising sediment, continuous, steady, approximately 1 meter dispersion height. No visible source disruption at the base. Another pause. Longer this time. Then Erickson said, "Maintain distance. Don't approach the cleared area. I'm going to make some calls." Maintain distance. In 6 years of saturation diving at that point, I had heard a dive supervisor say, "Maintain distance," maybe 3 times. It's not a phrase that gets used casually. It means, we don't know what that is, and until we do, you stay back. We stayed back. For the next 20 minutes, the 3 of us hovered at the edge of visibility from the cleared area and watched. The column kept rising, steady and slow and completely, utterly consistent. It didn't change. It didn't stop. It didn't accelerate. It just kept going, like it had been going for a long time before we arrived, and fully intended to keep going long after we left. I noticed something during those 20 minutes that I didn't report immediately. I've thought about why I didn't report it, and I think the honest answer is that I wasn't sure I was perceiving it correctly. When you're at depth for a long time, your senses do strange things. Not hallucinations, nothing that dramatic, but a kind of hypersensitivity. You notice things you might filter out at the surface. Sounds, vibrations, changes in pressure that your body registers before your brain does. What I noticed was this. The water around the cleared area felt different. Not colder. We had thermal sensors, and they were reading normal. Not moving differently. There was no current differential that the instruments could detect. But different in a way I can only describe as present. The way a room feels different when someone is standing in it, even if you can't see them. A quality of being occupied. I didn't report it because I knew exactly how it would sound on the comms line. I knew the difference between observable data and subjective experience, and I knew which one was my job to communicate. But I looked at Jensen, and Jensen looked at me, and I could tell from the set of his body, even through the dive suit, even at depth, that he felt it too. Priya's camera was still running. She hadn't stopped recording since we'd arrived at the structure. I found out later that she kept it running for the entire time we were down there, never once switching it off, even when Erickson called us back up. The footage, when we reviewed it in the SAT system afterward, showed exactly what we'd seen. The cleared area, the column, steady and continuous and completely inexplicable. It also showed something else, something that none of us had noticed while we were down there. Something at the edge of frame, just at the boundary of where our lights reached and the dark took over. A shape, not distinct, not clear. The kind of thing you could look at and tell yourself was a trick of the light. A piece of infrastructure you hadn't registered. A shadow thrown by the column's movement in the water. You could tell yourself that. Jensen watched the footage twice. Then he turned off the monitor and didn't say anything for a very long time. We were supposed to go back down the following morning for the repair work. That was the plan. That was what the schedule said and what the operational requirements demanded and what our contracts obligated us to do. That evening, Jensen went to Erickson's office and had a conversation that I wasn't present for. I don't know exactly what was said. What I know is that Jensen came back to the saturation system 2 hours later, sat down in the narrow common area, and looked at each of us in turn. He said, "Tomorrow's dive is postponed. Erickson is waiting on guidance from the operator." Torres asked what kind of guidance. Jensen said, "The kind that takes more than one phone call." Nobody asked anything else. We went to our bunks. I lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the platform and tried not to think about the footage, about the shape at the edge of frame, about the feeling I'd had hovering in the water above that cleared circle of seafloor. I mostly failed. Mac, whose bunk was directly across from mine, said into the dark at some point, "You felt it too, didn't you?" I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't have to. I said yes. He didn't say anything else. Neither did I. But somehow that exchange, 6 words total, was the most honest conversation any of us had about what happened that day, for a long time afterward. Because here's what nobody tells you about experiencing something you can't explain in a professional environment. The instinct isn't to talk about it. The instinct is to compress it, to file it in a part of your mind labeled "not yet," and keep doing your job. You don't get to be the diver who lost it over a sediment column. You don't get to be the one who couldn't go back down. Your reputation, your career, your sense of yourself as a person who functions under pressure, all of it depends on your ability to encounter the unknown and remain operational. So you compress it, and you lie in the dark and listen to the platform and tell yourself tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow, someone will have an explanation. Tomorrow, it will make sense. None of us slept much that night. I know because I could hear the others. The small movements, the restlessness. 6 experienced professionals lying in their bunks in a pressurized steel chamber in the middle of the North Sea. All of us awake, all of us quiet, all of us alone with the same thing. We just didn't know yet how much worse it was going to get. The explanation never came. Not a real one. Not the kind that actually explains anything. What came instead, on the morning of day 9, was a message from the operator's technical department stating that the sediment phenomenon had been reviewed and classified as a natural geological occurrence. Low-pressure gas migration from a shallow reservoir, no operational risk, dive operations to resume as scheduled. The message was 3 sentences long. It had the specific, efficient tone of something written by someone who wanted the conversation to end. Erickson read it to us in the briefing room. When he finished, he looked up from the paper and looked at each of us in a way that I remember very clearly. It wasn't the look of a man delivering reassuring news. It was the look of a man delivering a decision that had been made above his level and that he did not fully agree with, but was not in a position to contradict. He said, "Standard formation. Repair works on the pipeline section as originally tasked." Nobody said anything. Jensen looked at the table. Priya looked at her hands. I looked at the message in Erickson's hand and thought about the 3 sentences and how much they didn't say. We geared up in silence. That wasn't unusual. Pre-dive preparation is focused work. Nobody talks much anyway. But this silence had a different texture. The kind that happens when 6 people are all thinking the same thing and all deciding independently, not to say it out loud. Because if you say it out loud, you have to deal with it. And if you deal with it, you have to make a decision. And the decision available to you is one that ends your contract and your rotation. And possibly, depending on how it's characterized in the report, a significant portion of your professional reputation. So you don't say it out loud. You check your equipment. You run your systems. You breathe the heliox mix and feel it change the quality of your voice. And you climb into the bell and you go down. The 4 of us on the second rotation, me, Jensen, Torres, and Mac, descended at 7:12. Priya and Lindqvist were on standby for the afternoon rotation. The repair work was on a section of pipeline approximately 60 meters from the wellhead structure, close enough that the cleared area would be visible from our work position if we looked in that direction, far enough that we had a reason not to. I decided on the way down that I was not going to look in that direction. I kept that decision for exactly 14 minutes. The repair work was straightforward. A section of pipe coating that had deteriorated and was allowing minor corrosion needed to be cleaned, treated, and recoated. Jensen and Torres handled the primary work. Mac and I managed tools, monitored umbilicals, kept watch. Normal division of labor. The kind of job where your hands are busy and your mind can almost go somewhere else if you let it. I was watching the umbilical management when Mac tapped my arm. Single tap, not an emergency signal. The tap that means, "Look at this." I looked. He was pointing, not toward the wellhead, but along the pipeline in the other direction, toward a section we hadn't reached yet, further into the dark. His light was directed that way, and mine followed it. And for a moment I saw nothing but the pipeline and the sediment and the darkness beyond. Then I saw what he was pointing at. The cleared area wasn't just at the wellhead anymore. There was another one. Same characteristics. Circular, clean, bare rock at the center, maybe 2.5 meters in diameter. About 30 meters along the pipeline from our position. And in its center, the same column of rising sediment. Steady, slow, continuous. I reported it to Erickson immediately. His response took 4 seconds. In comms terms, 4 seconds is a long time. He said, "Understood. Continue work. Do not approach." I said, "There was only one of these yesterday." Another pause. Then, "Understood. Continue work." I looked at Mac. He looked at me. We both looked at Jensen, who had stopped working and was now also looking down the pipeline at the second cleared area. Jensen said, on the team channel so we could all hear, "How many do you think there are?" It wasn't a question he expected anyone to answer. It was the kind of thing you say when you're trying to measure the size of something by saying it out loud. Torres, without stopping his work, without even turning around, said, "Don't." Just that, don't. And we all understood what he meant. Don't start measuring it. Don't start cataloging it. Don't let your brain go to the place where you're trying to understand the full shape of this. Because if you do that, you won't be able to finish the job, and we need to finish the job and go back up. So we didn't. We worked. For the next 40 minutes, we worked. Jensen and Torres completed the primary repair. I ran the equipment checks. Mac monitored the perimeter. We communicated in the clipped, functional shorthand of people doing a job. We did not look down the pipeline more than we needed to. We did not discuss the second cleared area. We behaved in every observable way, like professionals doing exactly what they had been deployed to do. And then, at 8:54, Torres stopped working. Not the way Jensen had stopped the day before. Not a stillness, a freezing in place. Torres put down the tool he was holding, deliberately, carefully, set it on the pipeline surface, and straightened up. And then he turned around and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Torres was not a man who showed fear. I want to be clear about that. I had worked alongside Torres in conditions that would make most people quit the industry, and I had never once seen him rattled. He was the kind of diver who went quiet under pressure rather than loud, who solved problems by getting smaller and more precise rather than larger and more forceful. In all the years I'd known him, I'd seen him frustrated, tired, focused, occasionally amused. I had never seen him afraid. He was afraid now. He said on the team channel very quietly, "Something is behind me." I looked past him. My light swept the water. I saw the pipeline. I saw the sediment. I saw the dark beyond. I said, "I don't see anything." He said, "It's not where your light is." I moved my light, swept it in a wider arc. Still nothing. The water was clear enough, not great visibility, maybe 8 meters in good conditions. But there was nothing in the space behind Torres that I could identify as anything other than water and dark and the normal geometry of the seafloor. Jensen was already moving. He came around the pipeline and put himself beside Torres and directed his light in the same direction. Mac did the same from the opposite angle. 3 sets of lights covering every angle of the water behind Torres. Nothing. Torres hadn't moved. He was still standing exactly as he'd been when he put the tool down. He was breathing steadily. I could hear it on the comms. But there was a quality to the steadiness that told me it was controlled breathing. Deliberate breathing, the kind you do when the alternative is not breathing steadily. I said, "Torres, what did you see?" He said, "I didn't see anything." I said, "Then what?" He said, "I felt it. The same thing as the other day, but closer." We all knew what he meant. I had felt it the day before. Mac had confirmed it in the dark. The sense of something present that the instruments couldn't detect. The quality of occupied space. The feeling that the water around you was being shared with something that had no interest in being seen. I had felt it yesterday, at maybe a 15-20 meter distance. Torres was saying it had been directly behind him. Jensen said, "We're calling the bell." This was not standard protocol. The repair work was not complete. Calling the bell early meant reporting an abort to Ericsson, meant a notation in the dive log, meant questions and paperwork, and the kind of scrutiny that offshore workers generally prefer to avoid. In 11 years of saturation diving, I had called an early bell 3 times, all of them for genuine equipment or safety emergencies. Jensen called it without hesitation. Ericsson came on immediately. "What's the situation?" Jensen said, "We're coming up. Torres had an incident. No physical injury. We'll debrief on deck." A pause, then, "Understood. Bell is on its way." While we waited for the bell to descend to our depth, the 4 of us stayed in a tight formation. Lights outward. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the ambient noise of the platform structure transmitted through the water and our own breathing, and the distant, endless pressure of the ocean. And underneath it, I want to be precise about this, because I've second-guessed myself many times over the years. Underneath all of it, very faint, something that wasn't any of those things. A frequency, not a sound exactly. More like the sensation of a sound, felt in the chest and the back of the throat rather than heard through the ears. Consistent, rhythmic, almost like breathing, if breathing were something an ocean could do. The bell arrived. We got in. Jensen sealed the hatch. As we ascended, nobody spoke for a long time. Then Max said, to no one in particular, "There were 3 of them." I asked what he meant. He said, "The cleared areas? While you were watching Torres, I did a sweep. I could see 3 from where I was standing. 3 cleared areas. 1 at the wellhead, 1 along the pipeline, 1 further out. All of them active, all of them producing that steady, slow column." Jensen said, "Did you report it?" Max said, "Not yet." Jensen nodded slowly. He looked at the hatch above us as we rose, as if he could see through it to the platform, to the briefing room, to Ericsson, and the 3-sentence message from the operator's technical department. He said, "Then for now, we don't." I want to explain something about that moment, because I know how it sounds. Withholding operational information on an offshore platform is not something any of us would do casually. It carries real consequences. Safety consequences, professional consequences, legal ones in some circumstances. None of us were the kind of people who cut corners on reporting. But there was something in the way Max said it, the careful, neutral way, the way you report a fact you're not sure will be received correctly, that made Jensen's response feel like the only rational one. We had already reported a sediment column and received a 3-sentence dismissal. We had reported a second cleared area and been told to continue work. We had called an early bell for what on paper would look like a diver reporting a feeling. If we reported 3 cleared areas and a frequency that wasn't quite a sound, what were we going to get back? Another 3 sentences. So Jensen said we don't. And we rose in silence through 180 meters of cold black water. And none of us looked at each other. And when the bell broke the surface and the hatch opened and the gray October light came in, I breathed real air for the first time in hours and thought, we have to finish this rotation. 11 more days. I didn't know yet that we wouldn't. The debrief with Ericsson was short. Torres described what he'd experienced in the careful, factual language of a professional incident report. Eriksson listened without expression, asked 2 clarifying questions, made notes. At the end, he looked at Torres for a moment, and then looked at all of us and said, "I'm recommending a 24-hour operational pause, psychological welfare review for the full dive team. Then we reassess." Psychological welfare review. That's the phrase. That's the phrase that tells you what category your experience has been placed in. Torres, who had put his tool down and stood perfectly still and told us something was directly behind him in language as measured and controlled as any report I'd ever heard. Torres looked at Eriksson and said, with no inflection at all, "Understood." We filed out of the briefing room. In the corridor, Mac put his hand briefly on Torres's shoulder. Torres nodded. Nobody said anything about the 3 cleared areas. Nobody said anything about the frequency that wasn't quite a sound. We went back to the saturation system and ate and slept, or tried to sleep. And I lay in my bunk listening to the platform and thought about cleared circles on the seafloor and columns of rising sediment and the shape at the edge of the camera footage that Jensen had watched twice and then turned off. And I thought about something Lindqvist had said at dinner, days ago now, before any of this had happened. Quieter. Not quieter like the storm stopped. Quieter like something stopped. I finally understood what he meant. Something had stopped. Something that had been running, some ongoing process or presence or activity that the sea and the rock and the deep dark water had been engaged in for longer than any of us could measure. Something had paused briefly to notice that we were there. And then it had resumed. I think that was the most frightening part. Not that it was hostile. Not that it came after us. Not that it wanted anything from us at all. That we were simply so small and so brief and so completely beside the point. That it noticed us the way you notice a moth that lands on your arm in the dark. A moment of awareness, and then back to whatever it was doing. We were the moth. The 24-hour pause became 36 hours, then 48. Then Eriksson came to the saturation system on the morning of day 12 and told us the operator had made a decision. The rotation was being ended early. All dive operations suspended pending further geological assessment. Full platform crew to begin demobilization. We would be helicoptered out in groups starting the following morning. He said it quickly and without a lot of detail, which is how offshore managers deliver news they don't fully understand. Then he left. None of us cheered. None of us expressed relief. Torres stared at the floor. Mac looked at his hands. Jensen sat very still and said nothing. Lindqvist said, "What did the assessment find?" Nobody answered because nobody knew. I looked at Priya, who had been on the afternoon rotation the day of Torres's incident, who had gone down after we came up with Lindqvist to complete a different section of the survey work. She hadn't told us much about that dive. I realized, looking at her now, that she hadn't told us anything about it at all. I said, "Priya?" She looked at me. I said, "How many were there when you went down?" She held my gaze for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I stopped counting at 9. The helicopter came the next morning. Gray sky, gray sea, the platform getting smaller beneath us as we rose and banked and headed toward the coast. 6 of us in a row, helmets and kit bags, and the particular exhaustion of people who have spent weeks in a pressurized system and then encountered something that doesn't compress neatly into any category their training prepared them for. I looked out the window at the sea. From up here, it looked the way it always looked, vast and gray and indifferent and old. And somewhere below the surface 180 meters down, in a circle of clean bare rock on the seafloor, something was still rising, steady, slow, continuous, like it had been rising long before we arrived, like it would be rising long after we were gone. We didn't talk in the helicopter. That's not unusual. The noise makes a conversation difficult. And after a long rotation, most people are inside themselves anyway, already mentally transitioning back to the world on shore. But this was different. This was 6 people sitting in a row who had shared something that had no name and no file number and no place in the incident reporting system, and who were now, for the first time, separated from it by altitude and distance. I watched the others. Jensen had his eyes closed, but wasn't sleeping. I could tell by the set of his jaw, the small muscle working there. Torres was looking straight ahead at the back of the pilot's seat, with the fixed attention of someone concentrating on not thinking. Mac had his head turned toward the window on the other side, away from me. Lindqvist had his hands on his knees and was looking at them with an expression I can only describe as careful, like he was being careful with his own face. Priya was looking at the sea. She'd said 9, stopped counting at 9. I hadn't asked her anything else. The timing wasn't right. The space wasn't right. And some part of me wasn't sure I wanted the answer to the question that followed from 9, which was, how far did they extend? Were they just around the wellhead structure? Were they along the full length of the pipeline? Were they beyond the pipeline? How much of the sea floor? I looked away from Priya and looked at my own hands and told myself to stop. We landed at the onshore heliport outside Stavanger at 14:30. Ground transport to the operator's office for debriefs, which were individual, which meant we were separated into different rooms with different company representatives and asked to give accounts of the early demobilization. I gave mine in the same factual, clipped language I'd used on the comms. Anomalous sediment feature. Second occurrence noted during second dive. Team member reported sensory experience inconsistent with instrument readings. Dive supervisor made welfare assessment recommendation. Operator ended rotation. The representative, a young man in a good suit who looked like he'd never been further offshore than a harbor restaurant, typed everything I said into a laptop and nodded at intervals and asked no follow-up questions except one. He said, "Were you aware of any pre-existing psychological stressors among the dive team members prior to deployment?" I looked at him for a moment. I said, "No." He nodded and typed something. I said, "Were you aware that there were at least 9 of those sediment formations when we left? Not 1, 9. He looked up from the laptop. I said, "Because that seems like the more relevant question." He held my gaze for a moment with the expression of someone who has been briefed on exactly how to handle this specific situation. Then he said, "The geological assessment is being handled by a separate team. That's outside the scope of this debrief." I said, "What team? What are their findings?" He said, "That information isn't available at this stage." That information isn't available. I've heard that phrase many times in the years since. From the operator's representatives, from the platform management company, from the various HR and welfare support channels that reached out to us in the weeks following the demobilization. Everyone had a slightly different version of the same non-answer, delivered in the same careful, modulated tone, with the same quality of finality that told you the conversation was over even while it was technically still happening. I signed the debrief documentation. I collected my things. I walked out into the gray Norwegian afternoon and stood on the pavement outside the operator's building and breathed non-pressurized air and felt the particular disorientation of a man who has just been efficiently processed. Jensen was already outside, leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets, looking at the parking lot. I stood next to him, and we didn't say anything for a while. Then Jensen said, "They're not going to investigate it." I said, "You don't know that." He said, "I know exactly that." I didn't argue, because he was right and I knew it. The 3-sentence message on day 9 had told us everything we needed to know about how this was going to be handled. The geological assessment, the welfare reviews, the careful language of the debrief, all of it was architecture. The architecture of an organization moving an incident from the active pile to the closed pile as efficiently as possible. I said, "What about the footage?" Priya's camera, running the entire time, everything we'd seen, including the shape at the edge of frame. Jensen said, "The camera was logged as platform equipment, operator's property." I said, "She made copies." A pause, then, "I know." We stood there for another minute. Then Torres came out, and then Mac, and then Lynn Kvist, and finally Priya, who walked past all of us without making eye contact and got into a taxi and was gone. That was the last time I saw Priya for 8 months. I want to talk about what happened to us afterward. Not the dramatic version, not the version where we all fell apart spectacularly, where there were breakdowns and hospitalizations and late-night phone calls. Some of what happened was like that. But most of it was quieter. The quieter kind of falling apart that happens when something has shifted inside a person and they can't shift it back, and they have to figure out how to build a life around the shifted thing. Jensen took a shore-based consultancy role 3 weeks after we got back. After 18 years of saturation diving, one of the most experienced divers in the North Sea, he went to work in an office reviewing dive plans and safety documentation for an engineering firm in Aberdeen. He told me it was for family reasons. His daughter was getting older. He wanted to be home more. Maybe that was true. I didn't ask. When I spoke to him on the phone a few months later, he sounded like himself, mostly, except for a quality of distance that hadn't been there before. Like he was talking to me from slightly further away than the phone suggested. He never talked about the platform directly. Not to me. If I brought anything close to the subject, the conversation moved smoothly in another direction, the way water moves around an obstacle. I learned to stop trying. Torres and Mac took new contracts. Different platform, different operator, Gulf of Mexico. Torres told me afterward that he'd wanted to get back in the water quickly, that he'd found the waiting worse than the working. I understood that. The worst thing you can do after something frightening is give yourself too much time to sit with it. Get back to the job. Let the routine rebuild itself around the gap. But Torres only lasted 4 months on the Gulf contract. I heard through mutual contacts that he'd had an incident, not a safety incident, a behavioral one. He'd refused to enter the bell one morning during a scheduled dive. Stood in the dive system and told the dive supervisor he wasn't going down. No explanation, no negotiation, just no. He was stood down, sent for evaluation, and quietly not offered a renewal. Last I heard, Torres was working as a boat skipper on a fjord ferry route in western Norway. Never goes deeper than the draft of the ferry. Someone told me he seems happy. I hope that's true. Mac finished the Gulf contract and took another one, and then another one. He's still diving, as far as I know. Or was, as of the last time I had contact with him, which was about 2 years ago. Of all of us, Mac seemed the least changed by what happened. Or at least the best at not appearing changed. But the last time we spoke, at the end of a long phone call about nothing in particular, He said something that stayed with me. He said, "Do you still hear it?" I knew immediately what he meant. The frequency, the thing that wasn't quite a sound, felt in the chest and throat rather than heard. I said, "Sometimes." He said, "Yeah, me too." Then he changed the subject, and we talked for another 20 minutes about completely ordinary things. And when we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, not doing anything. Lindqvist left the offshore industry entirely. He'd been the youngest of us, and in some ways, I think that made it harder. He had more career ahead of him to reckon with, more years of diving in front of him that he'd have to decide whether to do or not. He went back to school, engineering degree, then a master's in something related to marine environmental systems. He sends me an email occasionally, brief and friendly. He never mentions the platform. But once, about 2 years after it happened, he sent me a link to an academic paper on anomalous sediment behavior in deep water geological formations. No message, just the link. I read the paper. It didn't describe what we saw. But the fact that he sent it told me he was still trying to find the shape of the thing. Still trying to build a box for it that made sense. I understood that impulse completely. I've never been able to stop doing it myself. And then there was Priya. Priya took the longest to surface in terms of contact. 8 months of silence after Stavanger. And then an email, short, factual, asking if I was well, saying she was working on something she wanted to share when it was ready. I replied. We exchanged a few messages. She didn't say what she was working on. I didn't ask. The something she was working on arrived 14 months after the demobilization. A file sent through an encrypted transfer service containing edited footage from her camera. Not the raw footage, edited. She'd taken the hours of material from both dives and cut it down to 47 minutes, the important parts. I watched it alone at night with headphones. The cleared areas were clear. The columns were clear. The progression, 1 on the first dive, 2 visible by the second, the wider survey Mac had done showing 3, was clear. And the shape at the edge of frame, which I had told myself over and over again, was an artifact of the lighting or the camera or my own pattern-seeking brain. In Priya's edit, she had taken the relevant sections and processed them, enhanced the contrast, stabilized the image. It was there. It was consistent across multiple frames. It was present in footage from both days. I'm not going to describe what it looked like. I've thought about this carefully, and I've decided that describing it doesn't serve anyone well, including me. What I will say is that it wasn't infrastructure. It wasn't a geological feature. It wasn't a known marine animal of any kind. It was there on day 1 before any of us reported feeling anything. It was there on day 2, closer. It was in 7 separate clips from Priya's dive, the afternoon rotation, after we'd come up. In 2 of those clips, it was not at the edge of frame. Priya had sent the file to 3 other people that I know of. A marine biologist at a Norwegian university who specialized in deep sea ecology, a retired offshore safety inspector she'd worked with years earlier, and someone I didn't recognize whose email domain suggested an academic institution in the United States. I don't know what any of them said back to her. What I know is that 6 weeks after she sent the file, Priya accepted a position with a research institution doing work on deep-sea geological monitoring systems. Desk work, analysis, no diving. She told me, in the last real conversation we had, that she didn't regret going down on those dives. She said, "We saw something that very few people have ever seen. That has to mean something. I asked her what she thought it meant. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think the ocean is much older than we treat it. And I think some things down there have been there long enough that they've become something we don't have a category for." I asked if she was afraid of it. She said, "I was afraid of it when I was next to it. Now I'm just..." She paused. Humbled. Is that the right word? I feel like I accidentally walked into a room I wasn't supposed to be in. And I've been trying to figure out ever since whether I was supposed to leave quietly or whether I was supposed to learn something while I was there. That was the most honest anyone had ever been about it. More honest than I'd managed to be with myself. I've thought about what she said many times since. About the room you weren't supposed to be in. About the choice between leaving quietly and trying to understand. I think most of us chose to leave quietly. The job demanded it. The life demanded it. The machinery of offshore industry, the contracts, the reports, the careful architecture of processed incidents demanded it. But something about leaving quietly has never sat right with me. Which is why I'm here. Which is why, after 6 years of carrying this, I'm finally telling it to strangers in the dark. Because the alternative is keeping it compressed, keeping it filed in the part of my mind labeled not yet, carrying it into a future where it never gets lighter, just heavier, just harder to put down. And because somewhere, I think Priya is right. We saw something, and that has to mean something. I just haven't figured out what yet. I left the offshore industry 14 months after Haakon Ridge. Not immediately, not dramatically. I finished one more contract, a different operator, different part of the North Sea, a platform so routine and uneventful that I sometimes wonder if I imagined the whole thing. Except I didn't. And the body doesn't let you pretend you did. Even when the mind tries, the body remembers. Every dive on that last contract, I went down and did my job and came back up and did it correctly and professionally and without incident. My reports were clean. My equipment checks were thorough. My performance assessments were positive. From the outside, I was exactly what I had always been. An experienced saturation diver doing his work in the reliable, methodical way that the industry depends on. On the inside, every single time the bell descended and the light from the surface faded and the dark came up around me, I felt it. Not always the frequency. Not always that specific sensation in the chest and throat. But the awareness, the knowledge that the dark wasn't empty, that the water around me was shared, that somewhere below whatever depth I was working at, further down than our lights could reach or our bells could safely go, something had been there long before the platforms and the pipelines and the carefully engineered infrastructure of the offshore industry, and would be there long after all of it was gone. I hadn't felt that before Haakon Ridge. Or maybe I had and hadn't had the language for it. Maybe that's what 11 years of saturation diving does. Strips away enough of the surface world's assumptions that eventually you start to perceive what was always there. I don't know. I've gone back and forth on that. What I know is that the awareness changed the work. Not in a way anyone could measure or document, but in a way I could feel every shift, a kind of heaviness that settled in before every dive and didn't fully lift until I was back in the bell and ascending, a weight that had nothing to do with the pressure of the water and everything to do with the knowledge of what the water contained. On the last dive of my last rotation, I was working alone on a section of infrastructure. Routine maintenance, low complexity. The kind of job you could do half asleep after enough years. and I was about halfway through when I stopped. Not because something was wrong, not because I saw or felt anything specific. I just stopped, and I hovered there in the dark water at depth, and I thought, I'm done. Not angry, not frightened, not traumatized, or not only that, just done. The way a door closes, the way a chapter ends. I finished the maintenance task with the same care I always applied, reported back to the surface, completed the dive log, and when I came back through the saturation system and into the ordinary air of the platform, I knew I wasn't going back down. I worked out my notice, I fulfilled my contractual obligations. I shook hands with people I respected and had worked alongside for years. And then I got on a helicopter for the last time and watched the platform get small beneath me and didn't look back. That was 4 years ago. People ask me if I miss it. The honest answer is that I miss parts of it. The focus, the clarity, the specific kind of competence that comes from doing difficult work well. I miss the team dynamic, the particular intimacy of people who live and work in close quarters under pressure. I miss Jensen in the way you miss someone who is still alive but has become unreachable. I don't miss the dark. Or, more precisely, I carry the dark with me now. It came up with me when I left. It lives in the part of my chest where the frequency used to be felt. On certain nights, in certain kinds of silence, I'm aware of it the way you're aware of an old injury in cold weather. Not painful, just present. A reminder that the world is larger than what we can measure, and older than what we can imagine, and largely, comprehensively indifferent to us in a way that is not cruel. Because cruelty requires awareness of the other, and we are simply too small and too brief to register. We are the moth. I said that before, and I believe it. I don't say it with despair. I've made a kind of peace with it over 4 years of sitting with the thing, turning it over and looking at all its sides. There is something. I want to be careful about this word, but I'll use it. Something clarifying about the experience. About having stood in the water above those cleared circles and felt the presence of something so far outside the human scale that comparison becomes meaningless. It made the small things smaller, but it also, strangely, made some things larger. The specific weight of a conversation with someone you love, the texture of an ordinary afternoon, the fact of being here at all, temporary and brief and improbable as we are. I think about Priya's question sometimes. Whether you're supposed to leave quietly or whether you're supposed to learn something, I think the answer is probably both. I think you leave quietly because you have to, because the room wasn't built for you and your presence in it was accidental and the only polite thing is to go. But you take what you learned, you carry it, and eventually, when enough time has passed and the weight has become familiar, you find a way to put it down somewhere that other people can find it, which is what this is. I've been asked in the years since whether I have theories about what it was, what the cleared areas were, what the columns were, what the shape in the footage was. People want explanations. I understand that. I wanted one too, for a long time. I went looking for one the way Lindqvist went looking. In papers, in reports, in the accounts of other people who'd worked the deep offshore and come back with something they couldn't file correctly. I found some things. Incomplete things. Suggestive things. Accounts from other divers, other platforms, other parts of the world's oceans that rhymed with what happened at Haakon Ridge without quite matching it. A pattern in the data that the data itself refused to confirm. The shape of a thing that moved every time I tried to look directly at it. I don't have an explanation, What I have is this. The ocean covers 71% of the surface of this planet. The average depth is 3,800 meters. We have mapped roughly 25% of the seafloor in meaningful detail. The deep sea is the largest living space on Earth and the least understood. Every year, marine biologists discover species that look like things a person might dream up in a fever. Creatures adapted to pressure and cold and darkness over timescales that make human history look like an afternoon. We have been sending divers to the seafloor for industrial purposes for 60 years. I am not saying what was at Haakon Ridge was a creature. I am not saying it was geological. I am not saying it was anything, because I genuinely do not know. And I have enough respect for the experience to refuse to put a label on it that makes it smaller than it was. What I am saying is this. We go down there. We build our structures on the seafloor and run our pipelines across it and treat it as a surface to be used. We brief our divers on pressure and temperature and flow rates and structural tolerances. We do not brief them on the possibility that the seafloor has been occupied in some form or by some process or presence for longer than our species has existed. We do not brief them because we do not acknowledge that possibility. Because acknowledging it would require us to reckon with what we don't know. And the offshore industry, like most industries, is not built for reckoning with what it doesn't know. Jensen knew. He knew from the moment he stopped in front of that first cleared circle. He put it down and walked away from it and went to work in an office in Aberdeen and never talked about it again. And I think that was the most honest response any of us had. The acknowledgement, clear and final, that some things cannot be integrated. They can only be set down. Torres knew, which is why he stood in the dive system one morning on a Gulf of Mexico platform and said no and meant it completely and never went back. Priya knew, and she chose the other thing. The looking, the trying to understand, the refusal to leave quietly without taking something with her. I respect that more than I can say, even if I couldn't do it myself. Mac knows. He hears the frequency sometimes, standing above water that doesn't go anywhere near 180 meters. And he changes the subject and keeps going. That takes a kind of strength I recognize. Lindqvist is building a vocabulary for it. Slowly, academically, in the language of marine environmental systems. I hope he finds what he's looking for. I hope the vocabulary exists. And me? I'm here, talking to people I've never met, in the dark, putting it down somewhere it can be found. 6 years of compression finally coming loose. I don't expect anyone to believe me. It's not why I'm doing this. Belief is for things that can be confirmed or denied. And this thing sits outside that system entirely. What I hope is simpler than belief. I hope that someone listening to this, somewhere, recognizes something, feels something shift slightly in the way they understand the world, carries something away that makes the ocean feel a little larger and a little more serious than it did before. Because it is. Whatever is down there, whatever has been down there, in the cold, in the dark, in the pressure, in the cleared circles and the rising columns and the shape at the edge of the frame, it is not waiting for us. It is not interested in us. It is not threatening us. It is simply there. It has always been there. And we are very new and very small. And we have barely begun to understand the surface of the world we live on, let alone what lies beneath. The last thing I want to say is this. After everything, after Haakon Ridge and the debrief and the contracts and the years of sitting with it, I went to the ocean, not to a dime just to be near it. I drove to the coast one morning early, before anyone else was there. And I sat on the rocks above the water and looked out at it for a long time. Gray and cold and enormous. The way the North Sea always is. The way all of it is, really. Gray and cold and enormous and older than anything. And sitting there, I felt not the fear, not the frequency, not the weight that had lived in my chest since the platform. Just the size of it, the sheer, absolute size of it. And something that took me a long time to identify as the right feeling to have about something that large and that old and that indifferent. Not fear, not peace, exactly. Something closer to honesty. The ocean does not know I exist. It does not care whether I understand it. It will be here when everything I have ever known is gone. And it will go on doing whatever it does in the dark at depth, in the cleared circles on the seafloor, in the frequencies that aren't quite sounds, in the shapes at the edge of what our lights can reach. And that is not a horror. That is just the truth. I sat there for a long time. Then I got up and went home. If you've been listening to this, if you've made it this far, thank you. And if any part of this felt true to you, if any part of it landed somewhere real, I'd like to know. Not because I'm looking for validation, just because the silence has been heavy for a long time and it's lighter now, knowing someone was on the other end of it. Leave me something in the comments. Tell me what you think was down there. Tell me if you felt it too.